All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first session in the Superpower Institute's three-part webinar series on green iron in Australia. My name is Adam Grant, and I'm Director of Communications at TSI. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're hosting this webinar on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay our respects to their elders past and present. We recognise their enduring connection to land, water, and culture. So this series is dedicated to unpacking TSI's latest report, A Green Iron Plan for Australia, Securing Prosperity in a Decarbonising World, which is a blueprint for how Australia can lead in the production and export of low emissions iron. Today, we're starting with the big picture. Dr. Ingrid Burfurd, sitting opposite me, will walk through the core economic and strategic rationale for green iron in Australia, why it matters, what's standing in the way, and what policy supports are needed to unlock this opportunity. Next week, we'll zoom in a little bit. Chris McMahon will lead a session on green iron production technologies, exploring hydrogen-based DRI and electric smelting, and how these approaches will align with Australian ore types and renewable energy. And in our final session, Max van Summeren and Ben Scott will present the results of our detailed regional modelling across 5 prospective production zones, comparing costs, infrastructure, and energy needs across different parts of Australia. We'd love you to join all 3 and to also share the links to those if you think others would benefit from this work. Some late breaking news on Chris's webinar next week. Due to a scheduling clash, that session, it looks like will take place a day earlier on Wednesday, the 12th of June. For those who've already registered, I hope that's not an inconvenience. We'll send an update after this session, and I hope you can still join us. And before I hand over to our CEO, Bathan Mullen, just a reminder, if you're interested in this work and in Australia's broader opportunities in the post-carbon economy, you can sign up to our newsletter at superpowerinstitute.com.au. We distribute a monthly newsletter that contains all relevant news, work, and events that relate to the Institute, and it's really the best place to stay up to date with Australia's superpower opportunity. So with that, I'll hand over to Bathan.
Thanks, Adam. And hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Bathan Mullen. I'm the CEO at the Superpower Institute. If you're not familiar with us, TSI is an independent economic research and policy institute focused on accelerating investment and global trade in clean, energy-intensive products. And we bring together experts across policy, economics, and industry to build a compelling case for how Australia can thrive and play an outsized role in the global shift to net zero. Today, we're here to talk about our new report, A Green Iron Plan for Australia, and it's a piece of work we're really excited about, which has been almost a year in the making. Much has been written about green iron and the opportunity for Australia, and we're certainly not the first to do so. The real value we bring is in connecting 2 important elements. The first is undertaking robust economic analysis of the cost of green iron production in 5 Australian locations under various conditions. And secondly, prescribing a policy pathway to realising the green iron opportunity in Australia. So that's why we've called it a plan for green iron in Australia. It's practical, optimistic, and backed by real analysis. To walk us through it, I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Ingrid Burfurd, who played a lead role in this work. Ingrid is a senior researcher at TSI with a background in economics and public policy. And she has, as you'll see today, a real knack of making complex issues clear and compelling. So with that, I'll hand over to Ingrid to take us through a green iron plan. Ingrid, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Bathan. And thank you everyone for giving up your lunchtime today to join us. My first goal today is to convince you all that Australia, first of all, needs a plan for green iron, policies that allow green iron exports to get established in Australia and to grow from there. We need a plan for green iron because Australia can prosper as a green iron producer as the world decarbonises. Australia has a comparative advantage in green iron underpinned by its remarkable natural endowments. It has abundant iron ore and renewable energy that can be harnessed at low cost. But market failures are a barrier to Australia's green iron opportunities. And so today, my second task is to convince you that government policies and support are justified as a remedy to these market failures. Because with soundly based policies and with timely action, green iron exports can underpin prosperity for generations. So today I will first explain why Australia has a comparative advantage in green iron and the scale of the opportunity. Second, I'll explain that contrary to recent commentary, Australia's iron can be used to produce green iron, and I'll explain how. And then I will describe the results from our green iron model, which helps us look around the corner and to anticipate what a green iron industry might look like in Australia. And finally, I'll describe how market failures stop green iron competing on a level playing field with carbon-intensive iron and the policies that are needed to correct these market failures. So turning first to the question of comparative advantage, I'm going to lean on the research presented in TSI's recent report, The New Energy Trade, which explains why Australia will have a comparative advantage in renewable energy and green exports. This work is by my colleague Ruben Finnegan. It evaluates how much electricity different countries will need as the world decarbonises and as fossil fuel-based processes are largely electrified. Everything from daily household activities, turning on our lights and our heating, to energy-intensive industrial processes like green steel production. What Ruben's work shows is that as the world decarbonises, most major economies will not have enough low-cost green energy to meet their future needs. This will drive a trade in green energy. But unlike fossil fuels, which are cheap and very easy to move around the world, renewable energy is extremely expensive and difficult to transport. Transportation of renewable energy requires seabed cables, or for renewable energy to be converted into carriers, such as green hydrogen, which then needs to be transported at a stable minus 256 degrees Celsius throughout its transport journey before it's then converted back into electricity. And through all of these stages, what happens is that energy value is lost. So in the case of green hydrogen, it's at least 60%, but other carriers, it's up to 80%. So because it will be cheaper and easier to move green goods than it is to move green energy, what that means is that production will migrate to locations with abundant, low-cost renewable energy. Rather than trading renewable energy directly, energy will be embedded in green products that are traded. So that brings us to the topic of today's webinar. Australia's comparative advantage in green iron is built on its abundant renewable energy resources, which can be harnessed at low cost, and its plentiful reserves of iron ore. Australia is also lucky to have a workforce with experience in mining and in the research that can support innovative technology, such as steelmaking processes, that will be needed during the decarbonisation transition. So crucial to all of this is the fact that iron making is an extraordinarily carbon-intensive process. It is the most energy-intensive part of steelmaking, and it is therefore the part of the steelmaking process where Australia has the most compelling comparative advantage. Taking a moment to sort of step back and draw all of this analysis together and to think of what it means for international trade. As the world decarbonises, steelmaking nations will not have enough low-cost renewable energy to make green iron as part of that steelmaking process at low cost. But Australia's comparative advantage in producing green iron means that steelmaking countries will benefit economically from being able to import Australian green iron rather than separately importing iron ore and very expensive renewable energy for the purposes of local production. With that sort of new energy trade, embodied energy trade in mind, we can turn to the three reasons that a green iron industry would be very good for Australia. The first is that green iron is an economic opportunity of historic scale. Leveraging its advantages in iron ore and renewable energy, Australia can move up the value chain from exporting raw commodities to higher value industrial materials. And the potential is enormous. So if green iron replaces iron ore as a primary export, it could generate up to $400 billion a year annually by 2060. And for the sake of comparison, Australians' iron ore exports are typically about $120 billion per year at the moment. The second thing is that green iron offers an incredibly important opportunity for Australia to contribute to global decarbonisation. Steelmaking is one of the largest industrial sources of carbon dioxide, responsible for 7 to 9% of global emissions. An Australian green iron industry could abate emissions equal to roughly 4% of the global total, which is more than 3 times Australia's current domestic emissions. And third, green iron exports provide a strategic hedge against the decline of fossil fuel exports. Coal and gas are 2 of Australia's 3 largest export industries, and they generate about $120 billion in export revenue each year. But most major economies have committed to reaching net zero between 2045 and 2070. While the timeline and the trajectory of global decarbonisation is uncertain, the direction is very clear. Fossil fuel demand will contract over the coming decades. Investing in industries where Australia enjoys a comparative advantage, such as green iron, is the most prudent way to safeguard national income and employment. But if Australia is to become a large-scale exporter, it's essential that Australian ores can be processed into green iron. And there is a common misunderstanding that Australian ores are not suitable. And this is wrong. So to explain how Australian ores can be used to make green iron, I'm going to take a quick detour into the basics of iron and steel making, and then I'll summarise carbon-intensive production processes and low-carbon technologies. To turn iron ore into steel, iron ore first needs to be processed into iron before that iron is refined into steel. I'm going to focus on the iron making step because that's the most energy intensive part of the process and therefore where Australia's comparative advantage lies. Iron ore contains iron oxide and gangue, which is the term that I'm going to use for all the non-iron material that is present in iron ore, such as silica and alumina. Iron oxide needs to be reduced into iron and gangue needs to be removed. Iron ore is made up of iron, so that's the Fe symbol, and oxygen, the O symbol. And to isolate the iron from the iron oxide, the oxygen needs to be stripped away. This process is called reduction because the iron oxide is reduced into the iron. The reduction process is based on a chemical reaction and an element needs to be introduced that can attract the oxygen away from the iron oxide. One option is to use carbon as the reductant. So if carbon is used, so we have our iron oxide with our iron and our oxygen, and then we introduce some carbon. And if that's the case, if carbon is used as our reductant, it combines then with the oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, so that's CO2. That then becomes the waste product from the iron making process. And of course, we also have this gangue, which needs to be removed from iron ore, and that requires high temperature processes. Another option for reducing iron ore into iron is to use hydrogen as the reductant. If hydrogen is used, it combines with the oxygen. So we have our iron oxide, we have our iron component, our oxygen component, and it combines in this case with hydrogen to produce water as a waste product. So that's our H and our 2 and our O instead of carbon dioxide. All right, so that's the process of turning iron ore into iron at a very high level. Now let's turn our minds to thinking about the technologies that do it at the moment in a very carbon-intensive way, and then how we can think about doing it in a green, low-carbon way. At the moment, about 90% of primary steel is made in the integrated blast furnace and basic oxygen furnace process. This is what you'll frequently see abbreviated to BF-BOF, BF-BOF. So first of all, a blast furnace reduces the iron ore and it melts the gangue. This leads to molten iron, which then flows directly into a basic oxygen furnace where that iron is refined into steel. Blast furnaces need to use coking coal or metallurgical coal as the source of the carbon for the reduction process. So as you would expect, given it's essentially, given we're feeding in coking coal, the process is extraordinarily carbon intensive. So the BF-BOF process produces about 2.3 tonnes of carbon dioxide for every tonne of steel that it produces. One advantage of blast furnaces is that they can process low and mid-grade ores. That's because they reach extremely high temperatures, which is capable of removing that gangue. So remember that non-iron component of our iron ore. And nearly all of Australia's iron ore exports are processed in this manner. At the moment, very high-grade ores are processed using direct reduction technology, which produces direct reduced iron, or DRI, which is another abbreviation you'll see frequently. Direct reduction processes currently use coal or natural gas as the chemical reductant in the reduction process. DRI is then processed into steel in an electric arc furnace. Direct reduction technology can't remove as much gangue as a blast furnace. So what that means is that DRI, this direct reduced iron, depends much more strongly on the quality of ore that is used as a feedstock. So if you feed in low or mid-grade ores, what you'll get is low or mid-grade DRI. This is one reason that at the moment, very high-grade ores are used in the DRI process. Now, the good news as we seek to decarbonise is that direct reduction processes can be decarbonised using green hydrogen as a reductant instead of carbon. So think back to that very quick explainer I gave a few minutes ago. When iron oxide separates into iron and oxygen, the oxygen combines with hydrogen to produce H2O or water, rather than carbon dioxide. But the thing is, blast furnaces cannot be decarbonised. And that's because they need to use coking coal as the reductant. In a decarbonised world, blast furnace technology will not be viable. The question then is how to process lower and mid-grade ores. Now, low and mid-grade ores can also be processed with direct reduction technology, but the challenge is that the resulting DRI will also be low and mid-grade and therefore unsuitable for feeding directly into electric arc furnaces. And that's because the direct reduction process doesn't have those high temperatures we need to get rid of gangue. But processors can therefore introduce an additional step. They can introduce an electric smelting furnace. These smelting furnaces reach higher temperatures than the direct reduction process, improving the quality of the DRI that is produced with low and mid-grade ores. So, with research into the best way to process Australian ores, existing direct reduction technologies can be used alongside electric smelting furnaces to make Australian green iron. Given that Australia will be able to process its iron ore into green iron, it's very useful to anticipate what that industry might look like, where green iron might be produced, and the cost of production in different locations. And it is modelling that gives us that glimpse around the corner that we're seeking, a preemptive best guess that helps us understand how a future industry might emerge and expand, and the effect of our policy recommendations. So what we do is we model green iron production in 5 locations. We look at the Pilbara, Geraldton and Kwinana in Western Australia, Gladstone in Queensland and the Eyre Peninsula in South Australia. These locations were chosen for their access to iron ore, whether locally or transported by ship, their access to ports, and very good renewable energy resources. The modelling incorporates two types of direct reduction technology: an inflexible green iron making process, which needs to operate continuously. This is based on existing direct reduction technology. We also model a flexible process which can ramp production up and down based on technology that is under development. Our model, in addition to these two types of technology, includes hourly renewable energy output data for each location, the availability and price of grid-connected electricity for all locations except the Pilbara, again using hourly historical data, and capital and operating costs for renewable energy, hydrogen electrolysis, green iron production, and associated infrastructure. We use dynamic optimization modelling to identify the lowest cost combination of investments and production in each location. This modelling sheds light on important features of production costs in a green iron industry. First, what it reveals is that flexible technology matters. Flexible technology does not require a continuous supply of renewable energy or green hydrogen, and it is likely to reduce the cost of producing green iron compared to technologies that require continuous operation. Because flexible technologies are still under development, they will require innovation support to be realised at a commercial scale. Second, a grid connection can reduce the cost of green iron because connected projects can benefit from shared electricity resources, and producers can sell electricity into the grid when prices are high and buy electricity when prices are low. And third, a producer's location is critical. Despite the advantage of abundant iron ore deposits, the Pilbara is unlikely to be one of Australia's lower cost locations, at least initially. Other locations in Australia have lower capital costs, advantages in existing infrastructure, and some regions also have better renewable energy. And unlike Pilbara ore, higher grade magnetite ore does not require smelting, which reduces the cost of production in the Eyre Peninsula and in Geraldton. So it may therefore make sense to ship ore from the Pilbara to other locations where green iron can be produced more cheaply, such as Gladstone or Kwinana, and both of those are included in our scenario analysis. And of course, a huge takeaway from this work is that all locations require very large investments in renewable energy. Most of this energy is used to produce green hydrogen. So an important takeaway from our work is that these projects will reshape electricity markets and investments, and that renewable energy is absolutely the foundation stone on which we can build green export industries in Australia. So, taking stock for a moment, we have a remarkable opportunity based on our comparative advantage, and Australian ore can be used to make green iron. There are several locations with access to iron ore and good renewable energy resources. We have locations that can produce green iron at low cost. But 3 major market failures are holding Australia's green iron industry back. These market failures constrain what Australia could otherwise achieve. The first market failure is the missing international carbon price. Because emissions from fossil fuel-based production are unpriced, iron and steel producers do not incur the true costs of their production and their emissions. This distorts the market, and it makes it very difficult for green iron to compete on a level playing field with carbon-intensive iron. The second market failure is under-provision of common user infrastructure. Like other major industries, green iron production requires large-scale shared infrastructure such as roads, transmission lines, pipelines and storage, and upgraded ports. These are the assets that have strong spillover benefits that private investors cannot capture so the private sector will not invest at an efficient scale. The third market failure takes the form of innovation spillovers and early mover risk. Early producers learn by doing. They have no alternative to doing it the hard way. They incur the costs of technical learning, process optimization, supply chain development, workforce training. And all of this knowledge is extremely valuable for later producers who follow in their footsteps. But early producers are not compensated for that extremely difficult learning by doing process. Without policy support, this disincentivizes early private investment. I'm going to focus now on the first market failure and to illustrate the effects of the missing carbon price. To do that, we apply a price based on forecasts for the EU emissions trading scheme in 2030, $155. And we look at what that would mean for green iron producers in Australia based on the results from our model. So what we can see here is that when producers do not pay for carbon emissions, carbon-intensive iron appears to be cheap relative to green iron because they're not paying the full cost of their emissions, the damage their emissions inflict. And so that creates this very pronounced cost gap between carbon-intensive iron and green iron. The way you can see that represented here is that carbon-intensive producers dominate the low-cost end of the supply curve for iron. If a carbon price were to be applied, what we can see is that the price for iron would rise in proportion to the embedded carbon. The cost gap between carbon-intensive and green iron is narrowed or eliminated. And carbon-intensive iron shifts further up the supply curve, while green iron shifts down and becomes more competitive. With efficient support, more Australian green iron producers would be able to compete in more segments of the iron market, which brings me to our recommendations. To correct for the lack of an international carbon price, we propose a green iron production tax credit worth $170. This is based on the carbon intensity of direct reduced iron that is produced with fossil fuels, which is the alternative, together with the forecast price for EU carbon permits in 2030. For producers that use green hydrogen as part of their production process, this credit should include the value of the government's existing hydrogen production tax incentive, which is worth $2 per kilogram of green hydrogen, so equivalent to about $110 of the $170 production tax credit we propose. So current support is already about 2/3 of where it needs to be if producers are using green hydrogen. That production tax credit would simulate the effects of an international carbon price. It would reduce the cost gap between carbon-intensive and green iron, and in some cases eliminate it. So, for example, compared to the price of international direct reduced iron, which is produced with fossil fuels, the cost gap with green iron would be completely eliminated in the Eyre Peninsula, which is consistent with the effects of a carbon price, and it would be substantially reduced for green iron produced in Geraldton. An efficient green iron production tax credit would mean more Australian green iron producers can compete in more segments of the iron market. Just like a carbon price, our proposed green iron production tax credit shifts green iron producers into the lower cost part of the supply curve, where they're better positioned to compete. In addition to addressing the missing international carbon price, the government should also support early producers who create that valuable knowledge that benefits later producers. The federal government should provide capital support for projects with a planned output of at least 500,000 tonnes per annum. This could build or draw on the already announced $1 billion Green Iron Investment Fund, and 2 levels of support should be available. Early investors should receive capital grants or equivalent tax benefits representing 15% of capital costs, but grants worth an additional 15% of capital costs should be made available for the first few users of a particular green iron technology deployed in Australia. Support should be capped at $500 million per project. Federal and state governments should provide efficient support for common user infrastructure. In locations that are most promising for multiple green iron projects, federal and state governments should support new natural monopoly infrastructure that is essential for green iron and other green exports, such as electricity transmission, hydrogen pipelines and storage, ports, and desalination and water supply in areas with no local water. This can take the form of direct government investment or support to private investors. Government's role in supporting infrastructure will solve the coordination problem that will otherwise delay or prevent investments in green iron production. This infrastructure use should be priced efficiently, so the cost of using infrastructure is not a barrier to early private investment in green iron. To promote production in low-cost locations, we propose an Australian green hydrogen certificate scheme, with green hydrogen producers earning tradable certificates that could be purchased and surrendered by green iron producers anywhere in Australia. This would mean that iron produced with natural gas could be recognised as green iron if produced with equivalent surrender of green hydrogen certificates, where that green hydrogen is produced in lower cost Australian locations. Producers of other green hydrogen-based products would also be included in the proposed scheme. And of course, governments should engage in international diplomatic efforts that create international demand for Australian green iron. Japan and South Korea are currently major destinations for Australian iron ore and are promising destinations for green iron. There's potential early demand from Europe, driven by the EU carbon price, and over the longer term, the opportunity is greatest in China, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. The Australian government should shape its guarantee of origin certificates to be compatible with the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism at the earliest possible date after the EU legislates its requirements. The Australian government should strengthen support for research on economic challenges and trade opportunities as the world decarbonises, to deepen and broaden countries' understanding of the scale of the decarbonisation challenge for the iron and steel sectors and the important role an Australian green iron export industry can play in strengthening our trade partners' economies. Federal and state governments should work with trade partners to secure financial support for Australian green iron projects in the form of contributions towards capital support and to help address the missing carbon price. Such contributions would recognise the shared benefits of successful Australian green iron projects for our trade partners as well as for Australia. And finally, the federal government should use international platforms to advocate for a system of international carbon prices. It should demonstrate Australia's commitment to the Paris Agreement with policies that simulate the effects of a carbon price and encourage the same in our trade partners. Our recommendations have substantial cost implications for Australia's budget, but are consistent with the Australian government's emphasis on productivity growth and its existing support for green hydrogen and other green exports. Only a small share of these costs would be borne before 2030, likely in the form of capital support for a small number of early green iron producers, with this support recognising the public benefits of innovation. This will be absolutely crucial for building early momentum. As green iron is produced, likely from the early 2030s, the government will incur additional costs in the form of our recommended production tax credit for green iron. This support will help correct the market failure of the missing international carbon price and will help ensure green iron is available for our trade partners as they decarbonise their iron and steel sectors. These policies should be a national priority because with efficient policy supports, Australia's first projects could be operational by 2030. These will serve as proof of concept, showing what is possible in Australia, attracting investment from our trade partners, and contributing to generations of prosperity and to global decarbonisation. So thank you all, first of all, for giving up your lunch times to join me to discuss Australia's green iron opportunity. But I'd also like to take this moment to thank the TSI Green Iron team, Chris, Farzana, Ben, Angela, and Anetta, and Max van Sommeren from Bivius, who led our modelling efforts. And of course, Ross Garno and Ruben Finnegan for his research showing why Australia can be a green export superpower in a decarbonising world. And I'm going to now pass back to Batham for some questions.
Thanks very much, Ingrid. We've got some questions coming through the Q&A function, so please have a look there and submit your questions, which Ingrid and the team will answer in this next part of the session. We've already got some questions coming through, so I'll pass these questions to Ingrid as I read them out. And Ingrid, feel free to bounce them back to me if you need a hand. So the first question here is, did the team consider government taking equity stakes versus grant funding for early producers?
Sorry, that was me missing the unmute cue. Did we consider the government taking an equity stake? We framed all of our analysis, first of all, in the framework of market failures and the best way to address that. So, obviously, there are a range of ways to conceive of correcting the market failure of the missing carbon price, and I think a lot of different policy proposals out there are ultimately working to achieve that goal. The question is, what policy tool do you think is the best tool for that purpose? The reason we favoured subsidies ahead of other policy options, such as government equity, is that subsidies offer a number of what we perceive as very important benefits. First of all, they are extremely transparent. And so there is that, which is important for a number of reasons. The first is that potential investors know in advance exactly what level of support that they're going to get for production, as to taxpayers. So that amount is, I think that certainty is useful for planning in a way that other policies are not from a commercial perspective, but also for accountability from the government and for taxpayers. In addition to that transparency, subsidies are also relatively easy to review in light of changes to the international environment. So, we're in a world now that is starting to think about the transition, the decarbonisation transition in these really energy intensive industries. And the world will look very different now compared to even 5 years' time. And so we can see that unfolding already. We can see, for example, the introduction of a carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe and the UK, but discussion about similar instruments in other parts of the world. We can also see the expansion of emissions trading schemes in Japan and in China, where iron and steel has just been brought under its emissions trading scheme. What all of that means is that the international carbon pricing landscape is changing and will continue to change. And at some point, that change will unfold quite quickly. What that will mean is Australia's trading partners will be better positioned to contribute to that cost gap that our subsidy is trying to compensate. And so with a subsidy, what you can do is put in place sort of a guaranteed level of support, which is targeted at correcting a very specific market failure. And then you can evaluate it through time, making sure that producers are no worse off, but that as international carbon pricing comes online, we can adjust the domestic subsidy, the production tax credit, to reflect that. So those two, that transparency and that capacity to be really responsive to the international carbon pricing environment and the policies of our trading partners were the reasons we favoured a subsidy ahead of other policy options.
Thanks, Ingrid. We've got a great list of questions coming through, and I should just apologise in advance if we don't get to them all. I'll have to make some difficult choices between them. Ingrid, the next question is about the time frame for green iron using a hydrogen DRI pathway. What is the time frame assumption for Australia to be able to produce green iron using green hydrogen in the DRI process?
Yep. Echo. So our hope and what we think is a reasonable expectation is that we could see early green iron producers using green hydrogen established by 2030. So what I haven't had a chance to go into in much depth today is some of the modelling work that we've done. So I strongly encourage everyone who's interested in this question to turn up to later webinars. What our modelling work shows is that there are locations in Australia that would allow green iron producers, particularly sort of early producers who are perhaps reducing their risk by producing, at least initially, smaller volumes, where they can use existing infrastructure and resources essentially to come online reasonably quickly. So in particular, the Eyre Peninsula was our single lowest cost location for green iron production. One reason for that is that South Australia has a very green electricity grid, which means that you can augment renewable energy build out to produce, for example, green hydrogen with energy from the grid. That connection, coupled with the high renewable energy content, is extremely valuable for a potential early green iron producer. So that's one example, and like I said, there's so much more I would like to talk about there. But basically, we are very optimistic that you could have green iron produced at a commercial but a smaller scale by 2030. And what that would do is, first of all, go through that hard early process that I talked about. That work that first producers do to figure out what works well, to establish supply chains, to iron out policy wrinkles, to train the workforce, before a green iron industry would then be better equipped to take off, get established, and also spread out geographically later on, and to capitalize on economies of scale as we get better at doing this and as we learn from those first early smaller scale producers.
Thanks, Ingrid. Next question is from John Pye. Thanks for your question, John. And it relates to the hydrogen swap concept, the credits recommendation that we make. So John says that it's a potentially problematic concept. He notes that green steel and green ammonia are probably the most prospective uses for green hydrogen. And therefore, is it useful to incentivize not co-locating hydrogen production and those two end uses? Could it lock in undesirable and suboptimal uses of green hydrogen, which is going to be a precious fuel?
Cool, thank you, John. So it's interesting that you've brought this up. We our thinking when we first of all explored this concept and then issued our proposed the recommendation for tradable green hydrogen certificates was actually to overcome the early coordination problems that can really potentially hold back green ammonia or green iron at different locations in Australia. So we also, I think, expect that in the longer term, co-location will be strongly advantageous for plenty of producers. But we're also aware of the fact that, in the shorter term, coordination can be difficult. And so what you might find, particularly as there's expensive learning by doing in those early years, is that green hydrogen producers will have a strong incentive to locate in places that have particularly abundant low-cost renewable energy resources. That might not be the same location where people are wanting to produce green iron or green ammonia. And so a certificate scheme allows producers of hydrogen compared to end-use products to locate at the place that is lowest cost now, to overcome those early coordination problems, but cognizant as well, of course, of the fact that there will be benefits through time, and scale through co-location. It's essentially just another way of opening up pathways to green iron and green ammonia. But of course, commercial producers, as with any large-scale industrial decision, will have to weigh up those different options for themselves with commercial information we don't have, and to decide what looks like the best location for them in the short, the medium, and the longer term. But my high level instinct on this is that creating options as you're trying to get industries up off the ground is a good thing.
Thanks, Ingrid. And yeah, I would just emphasize on that point that, John, I don't think the credits option is going to lock in use of green hydrogen in green iron. It just opens up that pathway more readily. And so if there are more economic options for use of hydrogen, for example, ammonia, those options will still be there and will be used because, for example, there'll be customer bases for that product. Keeping moving, this is a good question, important one to cover, I think, from Jeff Bice from Greenpeace. Jeff asks what the main factors are creating the cost difference between, say, the Pilbara and the Midwest. Is it just the availability of ore type, or were there other factors included, for example, port infrastructure, availability, remoteness, etc.?
Thank you. A very good question. And again, an excuse for me to plug my colleagues' upcoming webinars where they will be able to get into the modelling in much more detail than I can today. Very quickly though, the drivers of cost differences are many. They reflect, differences in renewable energy capacity in different locations. They reflect ore type. So I mentioned briefly, for example, that Pilbara ores, which are typically lower and mid-grade, require additional processing in the form of smelting, which is an added cost for production using those ores. But there are two other big ones that sort of really drive big differences between costs in the Pilbara and other parts of WA. One is what you frequently hear referred to as the Pilbara premium. So in all of our work, we used a location-specific adjustment for essentially the costs of doing business in each location, based on the same coefficients that are used, for example, by AMO. So, grounded in work that other organisations are using to look at large-scale investment, as we are. So the Pilbara premium, as you would expect, has an effect compared to everywhere else. And the other thing is that the Pilbara doesn't have the same access to other sources of electricity generation that every other location does. So the Pilbara is connected to the Northwest interconnected system. Geraldton and Kwinana have the Southwest. And so what that means is that for a producer in the Pilbara, in our model, which is necessarily a simplification, you don't have the same capacity to draw on other sources of electricity, which is particularly important if you're contemplating technologies that need to run continuously. So what that means is that you get a huge bump in cost because you have to really essentially overbuild. It's efficient, it's optimal, but you have to do a large share of your build out to avoid any dropout in energy supply through to your hydrogen, through to your green iron plant. And that's more expensive and requires more build out in the Pilbara than in other locations because they can draw from other resources much more easily because they have better access to bigger grids, basically. So those two really big drivers sort of at a quant level are the Pilbara premium and the effect of access to other electricity suppliers through a grid. But of course, renewable energy capacity and ore type plays into it as well.
Thanks, Ingrid. This is a somewhat curly question, but a good one for us to meet head on, I think. The questioner asks, the proposed $170 per tonne credit appears to close the price gap for flexible production technologies only, which the report acknowledges is in early development and not yet ready at scale. Is this essentially an acceptance that the price gap with existing inflexible technologies is too big? How soon do you believe flexible technologies will be ready at scale? Nice, easy one for you, Ingrid.
Okay. Ooh. Thank you. Curly question, but completely agree, important to address. So the first thing I would say is that in all of this, we are using models and price estimates to structure our analysis, but there's always, in any of this, I think, the best thing you can do is use these models to shape expectations rather than to get too fixated on the very specific amounts, not the 170, but the price gaps. So our estimates of, for example, prices for internationally traded HBI and pig iron, other carbon-intensive iron products, are based on quite small volume of international trade, things like that. So there is some, I would factor into any of my subsequent analysis the fact that there's degrees of uncertainty around all of these prices. But getting to the substantive point, I think that, what our modelling shows at the highest level is that there are certainly going to be big economic advantages to using flexible technology, which you'd expect, given we've got renewable energy, variable renewable energy as the main source. The timelines for that will depend, of course, on the level of support for innovation R&D, and particularly support for getting up commercial scale pilots, which we support and talk about a little bit more in our report. I would also say that some of well, and perhaps that's one for Chris to answer as well, so I'll pass to him in a second. But coming back to this question of, well, what does it mean if we have a $170 production tax credit and a remaining cost gap, which I think is really the kind of key analytical question. We've picked a production tax credit that we think is sort of economically efficient. And so what that means is that as we move closer to net zero, as the effective price of carbon rises to reflect that. It's carbon sort of, as we need to really pull back on our carbon use internationally. What you would see in practice if we had a carbon price is that cost gap would narrow. It will continue to. Carbon is just going to become too dangerous, too expensive to use. And so through time, even with more expensive technologies, that cost gap will close. And that's another reason we've advised that the production tax credit should be reviewed through time, because we recognise that, of course, the task gets more urgent as we get closer to the middle of the century. Chris, I think it's worth passing to Chris for a sort of on-the-ground idea about the actual timelines on when flexible technology should be available at commercial scale. But in the meantime, I would say as well to factor in that we have and recommend substantial support for early innovation and first movers. So when we talk about the PTC here, there should also be factored in the support for early capital investments alongside the PTC for those producers who move early.
Chris?
Yes, sure. Happy to jump in and be very concise on this. So this report is principally an economic analysis, not a technology analysis. So we didn't perform an exhaustive review of all of the alternative technologies. The flexible technology we chose to model was Calix's Zesty technology. They're an Australian company. You can jump onto their website and find out quite a lot about the technology and where it is at the moment. Suffice to say that they are quite well advanced in an arena application for a demonstration scale plant. And I think if they were answering this question, they would say that they hope to have this deployed commercially before 2030.
Thanks, Chris. Ingrid, there's a question from Jeff Brooks about the role of natural gas in the transition. I think it's important we address that.
For sure. Hi, Jeff. Thank you. So this is something we discussed at length at TSI. The question being asked is is essentially, I suppose, for the rest of the audience, gets to the focus of our production tax credit. So I've talked here about green hydrogen as a way of decarbonising iron production. What I didn't go into time constraints in much detail is the fact that you can also use natural gas as a way of reducing iron ore into iron using the direct reduction technology that I described earlier. So using gas does substantially reduce carbon emissions compared to a blast furnace, but it doesn't grind them out, doesn't grind them down as close to zero as green hydrogen does. And so one of the questions we faced was whether or not to essentially support natural gas as a transition fuel, or as a, in this case, transition reductant. And we decided against it. We decided against support for gas-based production of DRI, first of all, because it's not consistent with Australia's comparative advantage over the longer term. So we have a situation where the government, we don't have an international carbon price, and therefore it falls to the government and taxpayers to essentially subsidise the production of green goods in the meantime. And so we have a scarce budget, and at TSI we're very strong advocates for keeping a very keen eye on a strong budget, as well as efficient investments in green exports, but where those exports are consistent with Australia's comparative advantage. So even though gas is potentially a transition through to those to green hydrogen-based DRI, what we'd rather do is spend those scarce funds getting that hydrogen, that green hydrogen, online as soon and as strongly as possible, and creating the strongest possible incentive to do that.
Thanks, Ingrid. We've got time for one more question, and this might be a combination of me and you, Ingrid, but Rob Kelly asks, how would these regions plan for the development of shared use infrastructure with such uncertainty around future demand and production? Maybe I'll make a start, Ingrid, and you can jump in if you've got something to add. Rob, I think the key point there is that we see the critical element of our policy package being to address the missing carbon price. And when you do that and put green iron production on a level playing field with fossil fuel-based production sources, that is really going to be the main stimulus of interest in production of green iron in Australia. And once you do that, then we'll be able to see where projects are headed, where we'll be able to see where interest in projects is going, and infrastructure needs will need to be planned around where the interest in building the plants exists. We know there are areas like in the Midwest of WA around Oakajee where there is work being done on industrial precincts, and we're supportive of that kind of work that's going to look at how the different elements of infrastructure builds need to fit together and the coordination of all that and government's role in that. So that's part of the picture, but really just coming back to the point that we need to make green iron production economic before we can look to solving some of those other coordination problems. Okay, I think that is going to bring us to the end. Again, I need to apologise that we didn't get through all the questions. There were some really good ones in there that we didn't get the chance to answer. We will be happy to engage with anyone outside of the webinar who has questions about the work. Please feel free to get in touch with us and we'll endeavour to answer your questions. Just a reminder that this is the first of a three-part series of webinars following today's session, which was more the overview of the whole piece of work. Next Wednesday, we have a session with Chris McMahon on iron-making technologies and the production methods. And then the following week, we have a session with Max van Sommer and Ben Scott on the modelling exercise that we undertook, which was a major part of this work. So hopefully you enjoyed today's session and got something out of it, and your interest carries through to the sessions that we'll hold over the next couple of weeks. Appreciate all of your attendance today and your interest in our work. And as Adam mentioned at the beginning, we have a newsletter that you can sign up to on our website if you have interest in our work. Thanks all. Good to be with you today and look forward to keeping in touch. Bye-bye.